Aaron, do you want to begin?
Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to the launch of this research into the JST payments. We're absolutely delighted to be able to get to the end of this really interesting and very necessary research. I know there are people still filtering in. I'll just make a couple of remarks while our audience is coming in, because we have a great attendance from across academic, government and civil society. So we're delighted with that. By way of introduction, I'm Karen Kiernan. I'm CEO of One Family, and I'm just going to chair today's event. We'll keep you for an hour, no more. There will be time for Q&A at the end. And you can also find links to the research on our website if you would like to share it, and we will be sharing it on social as well. So we have a great panel to discuss the research, and we have a wonderful launcher who is Senator Alice Mary-Higgins. And before I introduce her, I just want to explain a little bit about the research. It's been undertaken by Dr. Joe Whelan from Trinity and Dr. Fiona Duclaw from UCC, and it's been funded under the Irish Research Council New Foundation Scheme, which requires a partnership between academics and a civil society organisation, and has been a really good collaboration, because the academic knowledge and expertise from our colleagues in Trinity and UCC has been amazing, and it's been a good marriage, if you will, with the experience of One Family delivering services to people who have been on the JST payment, and also we've access, I suppose, to parents and people. So it's been really good, and we look forward to continuing the collaboration so that the really important issues affecting one-parent families in Ireland can be dealt with. And it's a really important time. We're seeing kite flying already about the budget. And some of what we're hearing is of concern to us, because last year there was really nothing specific for lone parents, even though, unfortunately, they and their children are the poorest children in Ireland. They have least access to savings. They're much more likely to live in homelessness. And there's a massive body of research saying what needs to be done. And there was no category for lone parents. And again, we're hearing in the news today that carers, older people, and people with disabilities need to be supported in the next budget, as they absolutely do. But unfortunately, so do poor children and poor parents who are struggling, and many of whom are one-parent families reliant on social welfare, and many of whom are on the Jobseekers Transition Payment. So we hope and we know that this research is going to add to the value of the work that's there, and hopefully it will make a specific difference in next year's budget. So I'm going to introduce Senator Alice Mary-Higgins, which I'm sure is well known to everybody. She's here to launch the research today. She was first elected to the NUI panel for Shannon-Down in 2016 and then re-elected in 2020. Alice Mary is known as the hardest working senator in Ireland at the moment, which is very true. She's always been an advocate for social and economic equality, and she leads the civil engagement group in the Shannon, which is a group of independent senators with backgrounds in the NGO and civil society. She's a member of the Committee on Environment and Climate Action, Committee on Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform, and the Committee on Disability Matters. We know she's working hard because she's got some very significant and important pieces of work that she wants to get done before she goes on mat leave. So we're really delighted that you took the time to be with us today, Alice Mary.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And no, I'm delighted and I'm really honoured to be here today, because this is an issue that I've cared about for a long time when I worked with the National Women's Council in the past before I was in the Senate, and I think it's a very timely launch of this report. Not solely because, of course, it's very timely in terms of the budget and the important decisions that are coming up in respect of that, but it's been launched in a week where, just this week we've been debating again the mother and baby homes. We have the 5-year anniversary of repeal, and there's been a reminder, I think, of how for a very long time and historically, the Irish state has fallen short, sometimes very profoundly, but fallen short in terms of its treatment and its support for those who are having children alone, or who are having children and who are not married or in a particular model of relationship. And those failures and the work of repairing that is ongoing. And it is sadly the case still when we look to, and I know that, as well as the really very powerful experiential and qualitative work in this report, it also provides a really useful overview of some of the statistics, some of the kind of the quantitative figures that we have in relation to one-parent families, and the poverty levels that are still very, very strong and absolutely disproportionate in terms of what is experienced by those parenting alone. So I just first of all want to say, I really welcome the research. I want to commend Dr. Fiona Duclos from the School of Applied Social Studies in UCC, Dr. Joe Whelan from the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. Margaret Scanlon in terms of the Institute for Social Science and in the 21st century in UCC. I'm sorry for going back to the previous century in terms of these, but I think it is important because it places that context. And again, right through from core moments which we were marking last year, which was indeed the founding of Cherish, which became One Family, and that very first payment, which we're now at the 50 years of now, of the unmarried mother's allowance, the very first social welfare payment that kind of was giving the start in giving some recognition from the state of what was very much a reality for many women and continues to be a reality. And what is interesting that when we look to this moment now and we look to the statistics now is that the figures are still very stark and the inequality is still very stark. One-parent families are 2.5 times more likely to be experiencing deprivation than the general population. They are also much less likely to have any kind of safety net in terms of wealth. So not just income inequality, but we're also looking at a wealth inequality, where in terms of less likely to own a car, more at risk of homelessness, more at risk of consistent poverty. And again, this has always been one of the red flags, especially in a country which theoretically for a number of years now, when it comes to its budgeting, is meant to be applying a gender inequality lens to budgeting. We've seen the huge anomaly, the red flag in terms of that one-parent families, who are predominantly women, are consistently and disproportionately at risk of poverty in its different forms. And as well, of course, at higher risk of homelessness, which is becoming more acute now. So this is the kind of the context in which this review is taking place. And I think that was important because it gives a sense of why we need to ensure that we're getting the policies right in this area. And sadly, the policies in terms of job seeker transition and how it's been applied, and indeed some of the issues I'm going to come to now that the report dives into, there are a lot of mistakes being made. And it was really interesting to me in this research, as I say, it looks at the statistics, it looks at the overview, and it looks at the qualitative experience. And we have had some research in this area before, but very often that doesn't dive into what the actual lived experience is like. So for example, the Indicon research, which was government research done a few years ago, gave us some of the statistics in terms of one-parent families. But some of the most striking statistics were not delved into, were not explored and properly unpacked. So from that Indicon research, I was very struck by the fact of, I think the figures were 40, that a majority, so over 40% of respondents in the Indicon talked about a deterioration in their well-being following the introduction of Jobseekers Transitional and the move to that. And crucially, over 40% also reported deterioration in the well-being for their children. Now, that's striking when you are talking about deterioration in well-being, and that's the kind of detail, that's the kind of issue that needs and merits more exploration. And that's why I think this research is so valuable, because it dives into what is the experience, what actually happens for one-parent families in terms of as they try to navigate between the one-parent family payment, the job seeker transitional, and then indeed being thrown off the job seeker transitional and onto job seekers allowance when their child reaches the age of 14. A few of the issues that I wanted to kind of pick up, and are the practical effects, maybe some of the failures, and in terms of the intent of the policy. So in the intent of the policy, the stated intent was theoretically that it was going to be facilitating and supporting a transition into employment, and that employment is going to be a route out of poverty. But in the way that it had been applied, and even in the timing that had been applied, which is under the shadow of an austerity a dynamic and an austerity, a push towards austerity measures, we've seen that there's actually a contradiction in terms of the employment, and something that really shows up very starkly. That, in that transition point, for example, between the movement from one-parent family payment, from one-parent family payment to job seeker transitional, you actually have, and so many of the case studies that are examined here, disincentives. We create obstacles for those who were in employment, who were already in employment. So, it was very interesting where this came from originally. There's kind of the time of the Bosses and Babies report, and there was also a really important report from Mary Murphy and others that looked to, what an empowering or what they called a careful activation might be, that rather than a careless activation, in terms of, how do you support one-parent families into education, into employment, out of poverty? And what was very clear is that needed to be done in a way that was holistic, that recognized caring responsibilities, that was individualized and supportive. Instead, it seems that what we've had is a very blunt set of measures which can actually be counterproductive. So, for example, the inadequacies of the supports for those who are on one-parent family payment in terms of tailored supports, voluntary, non-compulsory supports for them in terms of accessing high-quality education and employment options. For those who become self-employed, and there's a lot of reasons why self-employment is something that a lot of one-parent families will choose, because it's something that you can sometimes structure the time yourself. It's one that people have been able to manage because it is a priority when you don't have another parent helping, to be able to manage your time and structure that in a way that's meaningful. So you have many one-parent families who would have been engaged in self-employment, but we have described in the report, Sabine, I think, is one who talks about having the fright of her life when she moved to Job Seekers Transitional and realized that she's not really allowed to work as a self-employed person anymore. And if she does, 50% would be deducted because the income disregard didn't apply in respect of self-employment or self-employed earnings. So again, you have a huge amount of fall off there. We also had those who were working and who were relying on the working family payment, previously the family income supplement, working family, as a top up. So effectively them working plus the family income supplement or the working family payment was important, that entitlement, and they realized they would lose that. So you have a lot, in fact, some of those most penalized by the transition in terms of how it was from one-parent family payment to job seekers transitional were those who were already working. And in fact, they found huge obstacles to continuing to work in that way. And indeed, then we also saw that those who wanted a kind of who are looking for a qualitative option, who have ideas and ambitions that they want to pursue, facing a template which is very much pushing them into the idea of any job, rather than, for example, it was largely individuals themselves who would be having to try to push for and really fight for example, quality back to education options that might give them a chance of a meaningful career. And I know this from direct work that I did myself with young unemployed people in rural Ireland in the past. You know, for example, where you saw people pushed into childminding or pushed into childcare because, you know, a intrio officer or other was literally saying, what do I know about you that you have a child? I'm going to push you into a childcare training course, when in fact a 3-year degree might be something that is going to take you really forward in a meaningful way. So that kind of question of the quality of the supports. I'm sorry, it's too interesting. So I'm getting too caught in the detail, and I will pull out of that. But the other piece that then happens is at 14, when a child is 14, leaving the job seeker transitional payment and being pushed onto job seekers allowance, where effectively your caring responsibilities become invisible, despite the fact that everybody knows many 14-year-olds need very particular care. The times and hours that you might need to work if you want to be available and there for a child after school hours, for example, become an issue, because at job seekers allowance period as well, you are required, you no longer have the full flexibility of schedule in terms of the hours that you're working. So there's a number of issues captured. This report is excellent. It dives really into it in detail. I want to just finish with maybe 2 or 3 quick points, which is that many of the recommendations made by this report were also made by the Joint Oireachtas Committee in the last Oireachtas, which I sat on, which was the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Social Protection. And we have, you know, that was back in 2017. Some of the specific pieces signaling that it was a mistake to remove income disregard, which has now been partially restored, so that's something. Signaling the mistake of excluding people from working family payment, that was signaled right back then. Signaling the need to re-examine that issue of the ending job seekers allowance at 14 was signaled back then again. And one really important one was the need for specific training for those in the social protection in terms of how they engage with those with lone parents and how and the quality of that engagement, and that tone and that issue of that tone, the fact that people are finding that they're not getting a quality of engagement, a tailored engagement, and in fact that there is a punitive and distrustful atmosphere. What that does is the opposite. And I'm just going to end, you know, with on that regard, a quote from one of the interviewees in the report, which I was really struck by. It was Ella, who spoke about how everybody's life is different, but when you show up at social welfare, you're usually showing up because you need help, you need support, you need someone to actually say, right, let's look at what's happening in your life and how we can help you and how we can support you. But instead, they think everyone's just trying to work the system. And I think that was a really striking piece for what we should be hoping for from our job seekers supports and from our social protection system is not treating people as if they're working the system, but instead saying, how can we make the system work for these people? And I think that's a really good motivator and a piece to be put forward. And I'm just going to finish by commenting, because I'm conscious of my timing. And I'm hoping, you know, I'm looking forward to the questions and the further discussion as well. I mentioned that it was an important moment right now in terms of looking backwards, but it's also a really important moment in terms of looking forwards. So coming into the next budget, when we're meant to be talking about well-being, and it's a well-being budget, and we're meant to be talking again about gender and equality budgeting, improving of budgets, and we know that there are finances there, it's absolutely vital that we get things right, that we look at what the Joint Oireachtas Committee, cross-party, said in 2017. We look at what this research and One Family and NGOs are telling us now, and that gets reflected in the budget. And another reason that that's really important is because we may be looking at a referendum in November, which is, I hope, going to give proper recognition to all families in the state, including the very large number of families who are one-parent families. and who are parenting alone and who are not married families. That idea of a wider recognition of all the families that make up the tapestry of Irish life. And currently our constitution has a narrow recognition in terms of what a family is, but also it is interesting that there is translation to that. You know, it is not the case that married couples are required that both members of that married couple are working full time in order to access social protection supports until their child, you know, when they have a child under the age of 18. That is a specific measure that is applied to one parent families, and it is an inequality. So I think it's going to be really important that the state take action to show, if they're going to have a constitutional referendum on care and on recognition of all families equally, that they fix the gaps in our social protection system and treat all families equally and properly recognise and support care. And I think that's going to be vital as we try to build the confidence of the public going into that referendum in the autumn. So again, it's a really interesting report. I encourage everybody to read it. And I want to just particularly commend both the researchers, as I've said, and those who spoke very eloquently about their own experiences. And that they're really, I mean, I had about 20 quotes from participants that struck me, but I've only given examples of one or two. But I think it's really powerful that people have spoken about their experiences in this way. And I think it provides a strong guidance to us moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senator. I think you'll have to imagine the applause. We can't do it online, unfortunately. But gosh, you really reminded me of the context in which Jobseekers Transition Allowance was introduced, and it was in austerity, and it was not in the context of childcare provision, which has improved hugely since then, although it's still not where it should be. And really, we had been recommending that there shouldn't be mandatory activation. We had done a national survey of lone parents in social welfare, and Doctors Michelle Miller and Rosemary Cross in Galway had done a focused piece in Galway, and the same was coming through. Work with those, put in the supports for all those parents who are the vast majority who want to work and build a career, often through education, as you say, so that they can move into sustainable employment of social welfare. But unfortunately, it was not done like that, and was done at a time of no heavy job losses, cuts to social welfare, and was an horrific time for people. And some of those measures have had to be reversed because they just could not work, but they haven't all been, unfortunately, yet. And you've also reminded me of the Indicon research that was commissioned by our now Taoiseach Leo Varadkar when he was Minister for Social Protection, and it was to look at the impacts of the reform process. And as well as what you've mentioned, what we also saw was that the people who then moved into part-time working or moved off of payment were living in constant deprivation. So not only was the well-being of them and their children affected, they were living in constant deprivation. And that report had no recommendations. It just was an unusual report at the time. So thank you so much for your deep analysis and your thinking and your commitment to people who struggle in Ireland. We really appreciate it. So I'm now going to move on and introduce our next speakers, who are two of the researchers on the report. So we have Dr. Joe Whelan, who is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College, Dublin. He's the convener of the Sociological Association of Ireland's Work, Markets and Welfare Study Group, and a member of the editorial collective of the high-impact scholarly journal Critical Social Policy. Joe's main area of research interest focuses on exploring the intersections of welfare, poverty and work to problematize and challenge common sense understandings in these contexts. He's particularly interested in exploring and documenting lived experiences in the context of welfare recipiency and poverty. In much of his work, lived experience as a form of knowledge and as a vital component of a holistic evidence base is something he constantly seeks to champion. Joe's monograph, Hidden Voices, Lived Experiences in the Irish Welfare Space, was published by Policy Press last year. Dr. Fiona Duclaw, Senior Lecturer in Social Policy and Director of the Bachelor of Social Science degree, also in the School of Applied Social Studies, is from the University College in Cork. And she's also a research associate with the Institute for Social Science in the 21st Century at UCC. Fiona's research covers the areas of Irish social protection policy, activation, the impact of austerity and how welfare states are changing. Her publications include a key text on Irish social policy entitled Irish Social Policy, a Critical Introduction, which she co-authored with Mairead Considine. The second edition was published in 2017 with Policy Press. She's also co-edited a book with Professor Mary Murphy, The Irish Welfare State in the 21st Century, Challenges and Changed, published by Palgrave in 2016. Her recent research is focused on two areas: the lived experience of welfare reform in the context of austerity and of the COVID-19 pandemic, and eco-social policy in terms of reimagining the links between work, welfare and care. She's also a member of the newly formed All-Ireland Social Security Network. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Margaret Scanlon, who was part of the research team involved in this project, who isn't speaking today but is with us. Margaret's a social researcher and research coordinator working at the Institute for Social Science in the 21st Century at UCC. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Karen, for that introduction, and thanks so much to Alice Mary for launching the report and speaking so incisively about some of the most important findings in terms of the work we've done. So at this point, Joe and I are briefly going to speak about the research. I'm just going to very quickly give a little bit of context for the project, which we've called In Transit. And then Joe is going to follow on with a more detailed look at some of the key findings. And before I do that, I also wanted to say some thank yous on behalf of the research team of myself, Joe and Margaret. So as Karen mentioned at the beginning, the research was funded by the Irish Research Council's New Foundations grant. And as social policy researchers, we're enormously grateful to have access to this type of funding. So it enables research on quite small but quite impactful projects, and very importantly, it helps to build strong and vibrant links between different planes of social policy as it exists in civil society and how it's researched also in academia, and it brings together in a very kind of synergistic way the work of civil society organizations like One Family and our particular set of research interests. So we've been enormously fortunate to work with One Family on the project. We couldn't have asked for better partners. We've been really grateful to Karen and also to Niamh Kelly, who's speaking later, for their help and for their generosity and their collaborative spirit with us from the very start of the project to today. There's also some other people who've been very helpful to us during the course of the project. They include, amongst others that I'll probably forget, but they include Louise Bayliss of Spark Ireland, and also Damien Butler, who works as a mature student support officer in UCC, where I'm based. And then finally, as Karen mentioned, and also Alice Mary mentioned already, we'd really like to acknowledge and thank the research participants involved in the project. We're really grateful to them for giving their time and for sharing their experiences of Jobseekers Transitional Payment, or JST. We know it's, for some people, it's not an easy thing to do, and one of the themes of the project is just the range of feelings and emotions and experiences involved in claiming welfare, which is not often a very positive experience for people. And that's one of the key things we wanted to do with the project, was to kind of highlight that texture of claiming welfare, and specifically JST, as quite a significant reform in the last decade or so. So if we move on to the next slide. This just really is a kind of another piece of context setting. As Alice Mary already mentioned, the origins of this line of reform comes from the introduction of unmarried mothers allowance in 1973. And things became very active in terms of efforts to reform from about the mid-2000s onwards, when support for lone parents came much more under the spotlight, vis-a-vis what was happening in other countries where age-based reforms were coming into play in terms of how lone parents were supported, and the norm or expectation that lone parents should primarily be workers rather than carers or parents as their children got older. So for JST, so it's quite a new payment. It's been fully in operation only about 8 years now, and quite a small number of people receive it. It's about 16,000 people every year, and 97% of those people are women or mothers caring for their children in one-parent families. So its introduction had a kind of a bumpy trajectory. The original reform would have seen support for lone parents ending at the point in which a person's youngest child would have been 7, and the original intention was for lone parents then to transition fully onto job seekers allowance, where they would no longer be primarily treated as carers in the system, but as workers or actively seeking work. And so what happened in Ireland, it very much mirrors, as I said, reform elsewhere, and it kind of sits on a spectrum between enabling and demanding activation. So if we move on again, Joe, what we were trying to do then is to try and probe into what is enabling about the payment and what is demanding about the payment, and what's the nature of the payment in terms of lived experience. And I've got a quotation here from Rice that the welfare state does not live in abstract regulations. And that's often how social policy treats the welfare state, as a set of abstract regulations, and we don't really know enough about lived experience, and we don't know about how the welfare state actually supports or doesn't support people at various points across the life course. And what we wanted to get at then was just the everyday reality of the realities of encountering the welfare state, of encountering the JST system and its administrators, and what balancing caring and working or being in education was like within the parameters of the payment. So it's a small scale study. That's what New Foundations is about, but it involves a very diverse participant group. We cover quite a number of life situations amongst the people who were involved in the research. And in total, we talked to a number of people in a focus group, and that was followed up by interviews with a further 10 people. And that might seem like a small number, but it's not so much about the number of participants. It's about the life stories. It's about the experience of those people and what it tells us about the texture and the lived reality of claiming welfare for people who claim JST. So we had people who were working part-time while on the payment, people who are in higher education, and people who are no longer working because, as Alice Mary already pointed out, it was no longer worth their while to be self-employed while they were claiming JST, which came as quite a shock to some of the participants that we talked to who were previously self-employed. And our participant group was made up primarily of mothers and also one father. And the work then builds on a small but growing body of lived experience research in the Irish social protection system, and also covering activation policy. And it's really important in that regard, because there's been a tradition maybe of looking at social security in very quantitative and econometric terms. And we wanted to kind of, like others, we want to kind of lift the lid on the system more and open up what the system means for people and how it affects the reality of citizens' lives in Ireland. And that also means kind of moving away from the predominantly kind of econometric way that social welfare is understood and valued, to actually valuing the lived realities of people who claim social welfare. And so in that regard, it builds on work previously done by sociologists like Tom Boland and Ray Griffin, by a range of work by Mary Murphy and Maynooth, also Finn and Maynooth, from extensive work recently published by Michael McGann, and also Joe's prior work in looking at welfare stigma in the Irish social protection system. And what we find, like as Alice Mary said, you know, our recommendations resonate with previous recommendations made by the Joint Oireachtas Committee. Our findings also really resonate with the existing research. So it's kind of building up a pattern of lived experience that needs to be taken into account in terms of future reforms and improvements to payments. So in terms of my final points, the final slide, just quickly mentioning the aims. I've spoken about most of them already. One of the things I want to mention is, in addition to a research report and a policy briefing, we've also worked on producing a claimant user guide based on our participants' experiences. So what we wanted to do was kind of produce a useful document, and we asked everybody we spoke to, what would they think would be useful for new entrants to the system to know? And in that sense, it's kind of paying experience forward, and it's like a guide to complement the facts and figures of how to claim the payment, what the rates are, what the rules are. This dives deeper into what it's like to claim the payment and what's important to know from the very beginning of encountering the social welfare system in that sense. And one of the key messages, or one of the strongest messages from that piece of the project that all our participants mentioned, is the importance of seeing the payment as an entitlement and making that payment or entitlement work as best as it possibly can for the particular situation each person finds them in, as they're parenting alone and looking after their children alone. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's going to talk in more detail about the range of findings.
Thank you, Fiona. Can you hear me? Okay. And thanks, Fiona. I know there have been several rounds of thank yous already, but I just want to say a few too, if that's okay. So thanks to Karen, to Neil, to Noel from One Family for all your support. And thanks to Chris upstairs in the Trinity Research Institute for Social Sciences, who was in the background helping this all happen. And of course, thanks to Dr. Margaret Scanlon, who was instrumental in the research. Really, I know Margaret's not speaking today, but it would be difficult to overestimate the contribution that she made. A special thank you, of course, to Senator Higgins for taking the time out of her busy schedule to be here with us to launch this report. And then finally, I'd like to thank all the research participants for giving up their time, for coming forward, for telling their stories, which, as Fiona has alluded to, can often be a difficult thing to do. But which makes research like this possible. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to present the selection of the findings, all of which and more are covered in detail in the report itself. And so what I present really is only a sample of what we uncovered in terms of the experiences and the themes that are in the report. And so I would encourage everyone to read the report, to use the report, to get a sense of the depth of what was uncovered. And the report will be available on the One Family website, as well as on Trinity website and on the ISS 21 website. So there's no shortage of places through which to access the report, so please do go and do that. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the findings. So the first thing I want to talk about is transitioning to JST. And perhaps what changed for some of the research participants. And again, I'm really only kind of touching on some of the major changes that people experienced when they made this transition onto JST. So first and foremost, a change of identity. So suddenly going from being a single parent, receiving support from the state, to having this new title of job seeker. And I'm going to draw directly on some of the words of the participants to try and illustrate these themes as I go through. So Margaret here, for example, talks about feeling anxious, from a financial point of view, but also feeling angry, angry that the fact that she had a child of 7 years old meant that all of a sudden she was being told she had to think about now going to work. I do also want to note that some people did experience the payment positively. You know, this was perhaps in the minority, but nevertheless, there were some positive experiences. And so Claire here does talk about the payment as being brilliant because it lets her work part-time and reflects the fact that she's a single parent. And this is how she describes it. So there were some positive experiences with the payment too. In terms of what changed, also a loss of income, which has been touched on a couple of times already in the session so far. Several of the participants who had been previously on one-parent family payment reported a loss of income when they transitioned onto JST, and the amounts varied depending on individual circumstances, but this did affect a sizable portion of the people that we spoke to. And I just want to evidence this here with an excerpt from Sally's interview, who talks about how big bills would come along and something would have to be put on the long finger. And this demonstrates the real material effects that this transition from one-parent family payment to Jobseekers Transitional Payment had in terms of people having to really think and consider their finances because of this change. Something else that was different was signing on and interacting more. So lots of the participants found themselves interacting more with staff in welfare offices, NGO staff and so on, and also found that they had to now sign on, which was something that hadn't characterized their previous experience of one-parent family payment. And lots of participants mentioned having to sign on every 3 months under JST, and a significant change to the experience of claiming welfare, which were unlike the conditions attached to one-parent family payment. So Aileen here talks about signing on, the fact that our circumstances haven't changed, but our payment has, and she talks about having to go down now every quarter to sign on. Sophie conveyed the anxiety of this procedure, of this renewed and more frequent interaction and contact, and describes its intrusiveness by saying that every few months you get your big long list of the whole life that they want to know about. In other words, the kinds of questions that you need to answer in order to satisfy your ongoing claim. Similarly, Lillian described the level of intrusion as wanting to know what you had for your dinner. So, you know, this increased level of interaction, this increased level of what many of the participants saw as intrusion, is something that was experienced as a significant change when they begun on Jobseekers Transitional Payment. So I'll move on now to the second theme, and that's about insecurities embedded in claiming Jobseekers Transitional Payment. So again, a change of tone, a change of texture, particularly for those who had previously been claiming one-parent family payment, characterized often by insecurities, which many of the participants felt were embedded in the payment. So Margaret here talks about insecurity generally and compares Jobseekers Transitional Payment to one-parent family payment, and says, I think with one-parent family payment, you were quite secure. You knew that you were going to get it no matter what, and it just dropped into the bank every week. But with Jobseekers Transitional Payment, there was always this cloud hanging over you, like, is it going to be removed because I'm not working? So again, this renewed, or this new sense of insecurity rather, that came with this transition onto a new payment, which is characterized by the idea of transitioning into work. There are also certain kinds of practices and circumstances that evoke feelings of insecurity and anxiety for the people who participated in this research. And again, this in a sense is nothing new, and many people who have taken part in research of this type around this kind of payment and other kinds of payments will have had similar experiences, will have had feelings of anxiety around similar kinds of practices. So for example, here Clodagh talks about receiving correspondence, just getting a letter telling you have an appointment, and you know, the tone of the letter being about how if you don't respond in a timely manner, if you don't attend your appointment, this could affect your future payments, and how that can lead to a sense of insecurity and to feelings of anxiety. Clodagh then talks about the meeting itself, so going to meet a case officer, going to meet someone in Intrio or in the local welfare branch, as being quite distressful. It's not that the content of the meeting necessarily set out to distress, but just that the event itself can provoke anxiety, can provoke insecurity. And Claudia says, even though there was nothing mentioned directly to me indicating anything that would upset me, that it just felt like something that provoked anxiety and insecurity. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the final theme that I'm going to talk about. And again, I'm really only kind of dipping a toe in the water in terms of what's in the report. And this covers interactions with Intrio our social welfare branch officers, which we've already spoken about briefly. And this is something that, you know, features into the recommendations we have at the end of the report too. So Sally here talks about a lack of information. Recalls being sent a letter telling her all of a sudden that she'd been moved on to Jobseekers Transitional Payment after the transfer had taken place. So, you know, I think this is obviously not the best way to hear that you've suddenly been put onto a different welfare payment. And Sally says, I never got anything. This was the bit that bugged her. I never got a letter 6 weeks beforehand or 8 weeks beforehand to tell her that her time on one-parent family payment was coming to an end. Rather, you know, this happened after it had already taken place. And so this kind of interaction through correspondence was something that lots of people found dissatisfactory at best, but very, very frustrating also. And then finally, the tone of communication overall. So this varied, and it's important to say that it did vary, and that many reported very, very positive experience with individual staff at a personal level. And so these were balanced either with an awareness of the rigidities of the system or with negative encounters with other staff. So while there was some positivity, and the system itself could appear to be rigid, which meant that the interaction would go in a certain way. And there were also some negative encounters with staff. So for example, here, Eileen talks about whenever you go down to the social welfare office, they just bark at you and expect you to know all the answers. And that clearly is indicative of a very negative experience. However, Ella talks about how, you know, in many ways, this is indicative of a broader systemic or structural component by saying that I think it comes down to what the caseworkers or what the system allows in terms of having a tiny bit of leeway there that will just support somebody. And so acknowledging that the system itself plays a role in how these kinds of communications and interactions are often experienced. Okay, so that's it from me. And that's just to give people who have come to the launch a flavor of what's in the report. Hopefully that has prompted you to want to go and read further. As I said at the outset, this is, you know, it's a really detailed report, really rich qualitative data, which gives a real sense of the lived experiences of those who are receiving Jobseekers Transitional Payment. So I would encourage everybody to go and read it, access it at one of the various locations and read it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Joe and Fiona, for that really great tour, I suppose, of the research, and for letting the experiences of parents shine through, because that's what's really important and unique in both of your research approaches. So that's really informative. And the issue around training for staff in Department of Social Protection, as Alice Mary Higgins mentioned earlier, has been around for quite a long time. And when we hear the actual impacts on parents, which can be very long lasting, we can see how important it is. In fact, we would even recommend trauma-informed approach should be considered, because so many people really struggle in being a social welfare customer, and it's not straightforward for them at all. We're a little late, but if there are questions, and we've been getting some in, we'd love to be able to take an extra couple of minutes to deal with those. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A. Just to be clear, the report is available online for everybody. It's available through our social media and also our website, and will be available through Trinity and UCC in time. So I'm delighted to announce our last speaker, who is my colleague. Niamh Kelly is our policy manager in One Family and has led this research from One Family's perspective, and is now going to respond on our behalf. Thank you, Niamh.
Thanks, Karen. I'm just going to turn down my speakers so there's no feedback. Great. Well, that was really interesting to hear from both Fiona and Joe. We've, as Karen's mentioned, we've been really delighted to partner in this research, and it's been interesting from our perspective to see, I suppose, a lot of the things that we hear coming up in our work underlined in the research. So I'm going to just give a little bit of a response from our perspective on the research, and particularly focusing on the recommendations, the policy recommendations contained in the report. In terms of background, a lot of this has been covered already, so I won't dwell on it. Obviously, where JST came from, the reform of the one-parent family payment beginning in 2012. But really, I suppose just the key point to point out is that what developed out of that were these two new cliff edge ages for children, one at 7 and one at 14, and what we would see as largely arbitrary ages. I mean, certainly there's nothing that happens at 14 years that means children don't need care or don't need to be looked after or don't need a parental role. The reforms were brought in with the promise of, huge reforms in early years and school age childcare. And whilst there have been developments in the last decade, certainly there are still challenges in relation to early years, and particularly in relation to school age childcare. There's a lack of provision of age appropriate school age care, and I'll touch a bit more on that. And finally, then, as has been covered, I mean, one of the legacy issues from the reforms, the one-parent family payment, is the high rates of child poverty, in-work poverty, and deprivation amongst one-parent families. So that's something that we see consistently coming through year after year. And as the figures change over the years, certainly what doesn't change is the ratio of poverty that one-parent families experience compared to two-parent families and the general population. So looking then at the recommendations, so training has obviously been mentioned already, so I won't dwell on it. Just to add that it is a recommendation of the 2017 Joint Directors Committee report, as Alice, Mary and Karen both mentioned. It's also, that report is also referenced in the programme for government, and it's something that has come up from parents that we speak to and from previous research that we've done with parents around what they'd like to see change and what they think that could help their experiences of engaging with public services in general, but particularly the Department of Social Protection. In terms of the tone of interactions, we did a piece of research last year around the public sector duty and the experiences of parents in interacting with public services. And, I think it's important to think of the public sector duty when we think of the tone of interactions, and particularly on the requirement to respect and dignity, to, for services to acknowledge, public services to acknowledge how they're interacting with parents and to be mindful of their human rights, particularly around respect and dignity. One thing that came up in the research, and it wasn't a surprise to us to see it there, it's something that we get feedback from parents on quite frequently, is around the stopping or diverting of payments. So this is, the practice of somebody's payment being moved to another location. Oftentimes this happens without the parent being notified, without their having an understanding of why it's happened. And in some instances, the post office that normally receives the payment, or where they normally collect the payment, hasn't been notified. So the parent, we talk to parents who are in the situation where they are having to pick up their child from school, and in the meantime rushing to try and find their payment, trying to find a way of accessing another post office to collect their payment. All of this causes a huge amount of stress. And I think referring back to that piece around dignity and respect, it can really add to a parent's stress and deterioration in their, I suppose, their mental health, in terms of trying to get by, particularly in light of, parents would raise things like access to transport to go and get the payment. So it's something that One Family has been working on advocating against and looking for other solutions to how the department can address issues that arise. And it's something that we've been working with our colleagues in the National One Parent Family Alliance on also. Something that came up as a recommendation and is quite a clear one is really around better information for parents. So, obviously there's a need for more information, and that came out clearly, but also I suppose there's an onus on the department to maybe look at those transition periods, that period, that age 7 switch into JST, or again at age 14 when parents are transitioning off JST, as an opportunity to engage with parents and to give them the information that they need in advance, but also to support them at that time, because it's a crucial time and an opening for them. And then the need for an individualized approach. I just want to speak briefly about One Family's programs that we operate in-house in One Family. So our New Futures Employability Program, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of it as an example of an individualized approach that can work really well for parents. So it's a group-based training course focusing on the needs and career planning of parents and looking at their personal development on an individualized basis. We provide wraparound family support services that includes things like counseling, parent mentoring, and courses for parents. So it's not just looking at their employment and education, it's also looking at their other new needs. So taking the family, taking a holistic approach to the family. Participants receive individualized sessions with key workers, and I think this is a key part of the program. Obviously, the key workers are very well trained, and they have a good understanding of the experiences of one-parent families, and that can make a big difference in terms of the engagement that parents receive. And then finally, just to say that in 21-22, in that term, there was a 73% progression rate from New Futures into either training or employment. And I mean, I think that it provides a really good example of where, with a bit of support and a bit of an understanding, particularly around their needs, parents can progress into careers and progress into training that's meaningful and doesn't pigeonhole them into low pay or insecure employment opportunities. So just to continue on then with the final recommendations in the report. One recommendation is around childcare, and I've mentioned this previously, but we hear from parents a lot that there is simply no age-appropriate childcare for their teen or young person. I mean, this starts earlier than 14. You hear from parents of children who are 11 and 12 that they no longer want to go to their after school, that it's not, they're not doing activities that are meaningful to them or that are appropriate for their development. And there's just not a lot of alternatives out there. And I suppose to note that the Irish government has signed up to the European Child Guarantee, which recommends access to free childcare for any child in a one-parent family. So this is something that is an overarching goal, I suppose, within the country already, but it's something that needs to be speeded up, both in terms of the financial supports that are available and in terms of the provision of the services. There was a few recommendations around amending the scheme, and Alice Mary, I think, spoke quite eloquently about these, that access to working family payment and the experience of people who are self-employed on Jobseekers Transitional Payment is an area that really needs to be looked at, particularly around incentivizing parents to stay and work. I think both of these affect parents' ability to either stay in their employment, and particularly around the self-employed. I mean, we've heard from a number of parents who say it's simply not worth their while staying self-employed, and self-employed work is very attractive to lone parents because it can be more flexible. The hours can be built around their caring responsibilities. So that's something that we certainly would like to see addressed. And then finally, the core recommendation in terms of our work and in terms of what we feel will make the biggest difference. And again, it is another recommendation of the 2017 report from the Oireachtas Committee on Social Protection, is around extending Jobseekers Transitional Payment until the youngest child has finished secondary school. The 14-year cutoff, it really ignores, the state is ignoring parents' caring responsibilities. You know, 14-year-olds still need their parents, they still need care. And crucially, it is reducing income at a time when we know children become more expensive. And this is acknowledged by the differential rates in the IQC payment at 12. So it's a time that parents need additional financial supports, and they're receiving reduced support. So this is something that is one of our core recommendations. It's one of the core recommendations of the National One Parent Family Alliance, which we chair. And it's something that we would really like to see addressed in this year's budget in terms of preventing child poverty and providing meaningful change for the families that we work with. So thank you very much. I suppose just to finish and say that we've really, delighted to have the opportunity to participate or to partner in the research. And it is our hope that policymakers can use this research to make the changes necessary to better support families and to better reduce child poverty. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Niamh. That was great. And I think that we've gotten some interesting questions in, and a number of them have been addressed, but I wanted to just direct one briefly to Fiona or Joe in terms of what research do you think may be needed next, or what steps do you think may be needed next? Or are you finished? Is all the research done and now it's time for action?
I might jump in there. Joe might have more to say as well, but like in a way, what we did here is like the tip of the iceberg, and I think there's just so much more scope for this type of research to be done, but this type of knowledge to be produced. So, to acknowledge kind of like what I'm always banging on about, but different ways of knowing and understanding the reality of a social welfare system from a claimant point of view is just so important, I think, just for the texture of social citizenship and for democracy and for just ensuring that people are heard, that their voices and kind of lived reality richly informs how the welfare state or the Irish welfare state looks after everyone, both adult and child. So I think there's huge potential for more of this kind of research and to build a bigger picture of how the welfare state is experienced in Ireland. It's more advanced in other countries, and really we're just starting here, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting in terms of claimants' experience. Alice Mary, can I just ask you if you'd one thing that you would say to government that you'd like to see in the budget, what would it be?
I think the fundamental one for me is the move to 18 or the finishing of secondary school. So I think that's because there's a lot that needs to be reformed within the Jobseekers Transitional, but the idea of treating children at 14 disappearing the caring responsibilities, and even things like the shift to the 3-day requirements so that you can't even, let alone childcare, you can't even design your work in a way. So for me, that's a fundamental one. But I have been really struck by, I think the other piece is around an examination of the kinds of engagement. So that piece around the cutting off was something I wasn't as aware of till I read the research, and I was really struck by that issue. So I think to begin, just in terms of equality and recognition of care, they have to move to the recognition of the 18 piece. That's fundamental, and we'll be pushing for that in the budget. I think it'll be one of the tests of the budget. But then the other pieces is, as I say, you know, they reversed policy on income disregard because it was wrong. And if they can show the same willingness to be flexible and move on some of those other issues that have been mentioned, like for self-employed people, like on working family payment, I think just a really meaningful engagement on this would be really important for the Department of Social Protection. So we'll be looking to it with a lot of interest, and we'll certainly keep reminding them of these proposals. And yeah.
Thank you. And it just shows the value of evidence and high quality research and the voices of parents directly affected and that coming through. So hopefully what we will see is that this research is used and listened to by government and that appropriate policies are put in place. So I know there's been a lot of thanks done, so I'm just going to very briefly thank the parents who contributed to this report. We hugely appreciate your time, your honesty and your bravery. Thank you to the researchers, Joe, Fiona and Margaret. Thank you to Alice Mary Higgins for launching the research for us today. And thank you to my colleagues, Niamh Kelly and Noel Sweeney, for your work on this. One Family will be using this research in our pre-budget submission. And of course, the members of the National One Parent Family Alliance will also be very alive to it and will be able to add weight and value, I think, to what we're looking for based on the evidence. And hopefully this will also influence the work of the new Child Poverty Unit in the Department of Taoiseach and the new Children's Framework, which is being finalised. So we hope that it will work its way into various areas. So thank you all so much. We had a great attendance and many of you have stuck through to 6 minutes over, which I apologise for. And we look forward to engaging with many of you again in the coming months and years. So thank you very much, and slán.